Just a nurse. Maybe if you spent less time questioning your betters, you'd actually be competent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Danielle Ross pushed through the emergency department doors at St. Michael's, the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hitting her nostrils like it did every morning at 5:16 a.m. 20 years she'd walked these corridors. 20 years of steady hands and measured breaths, of knowing when a patient was about to crash before the monitor screamed it, of catching what other people missed. 20 years of being invisible. She moved through the ward without looking up. Past the triage desk where the younger nurses gossiped. Past the residents clustered around a trauma board. Past the attending physicians who never seemed to notice her at all. Her scrubs were navy blue, faded from too many washings. Her ID badge hung crooked against her ribs. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight it erased her face. This was the uniform of disappearance. The locker room was empty. Danielle opened her assigned metal cabinet and stared at the single personal item she allowed herself, a tarnished military challenge coin wedged in a corner behind her spare compression socks. She reached for it without thinking, her thumb running across the oxidized surface. The eagle on one side was barely visible now, worn smooth by 20 years of hands that refused to forget. On the reverse, if anyone cared to look, was a single word in tiny letters, Nightingale. But no one cared to look. She turned the coin over once. Twice. The weight of it was nothing. The meaning of it was everything. Baghdad. 2004, a 6-year-old boy bleeding out beneath fallen concrete while rounds snapped overhead like angry wasps. A classified operation. A commendation she could never claim. Records that had been erased so thoroughly that Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross officially did not exist. The Navy had buried her identity so deep that even she sometimes wondered if that woman had ever been real. Danielle pocketed the coin and headed for the ER. The morning shift stretched ahead, predictable and long. Chest pain in Bay 3. A motorcycle accident in Trauma 2. A woman in her 60s with a kidney stone screaming like she was being murdered, which, in a way, she was, by her own body. Danielle moved between them with the efficiency of muscle memory, checking vitals, running labs, adjusting medications. Her hands did their work while her mind stayed somewhere else. Always somewhere else. That was when Dr. Whitfield entered the ward like weather moving in. He was tall, maybe 55, with the kind of jawline that belonged in magazines from a decade ago and the kind of hands that had never worked harder than signing his name. His lab coat was pristine. His shoes cost more than Danielle's entire wardrobe. He carried himself like a man who had never been told no, which, in Savannah's private healthcare circles, was probably accurate. Danielle was reviewing medication orders at the nurse's station when Whitfield passed behind her. She didn't acknowledge him. She never acknowledged the doctors unless they spoke to her directly. But she watched him in her peripheral vision, and what she saw made her careful eyes go very still. The orders in his hand were not routine. The dosages he'd written for his network of specialty referrals were escalated, exactly the kind of inflated medications that justified higher billing codes, which justified higher insurance claims, which justified the referral kickbacks she'd noticed 6 months ago when she started reconciling his pharmaceutical requisitions against actual patient needs. 30% came back to him. She was sure of it. The billing codes didn't lie. The patterns didn't lie. She said nothing. She flagged the orders anyway, as she always did, her notes clinical and sparse, dosage exceeds standard protocol for patient weight. Recommend physician review. Whitfield found her an hour later in the medication preparation room. The space was tight, stainless steel counters, plastic bins of syringes, bottles of drugs in alphabetical order. The smell of isopropyl alcohol cut through the air like winter cold. "Your flag on my order," he said. It wasn't a question. Danielle's hands didn't pause. She was drawing up a heparin for a post-op patient. Dosage was outside parameters. "I'm the attending physician, Ms. Ross." His voice had a smile in it, the kind of smile that came right before the knife. "I determine the parameters. Nurses execute orders. There's a distinction." She finished the heparin. Capped the syringe. Labeled it. Set it precisely in the medication drawer. Only then did she turn to face him. Her jaw was relaxed. Her shoulders were loose. Her eyes were 2 shades darker than they'd been a moment before, but only if someone was looking close enough. And Dr. Whitfield wasn't looking close. He was too used to people folding. Standard dosing is in the hospital protocol, Danielle said quietly. Her voice had the texture of someone who had learned long ago that softness could be a weapon too. I'm obligated to flag discrepancies. For a moment, Whitfield stared at her like she was a stain on his sleeve. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and suffocating. Close enough that she could see the small scar on his left temple, a razor-clean line that suggested a fight he'd won very quickly. You know what your problem is, Danielle. He used her first name the way other men used profanity. You don't understand hierarchy. You think that 30 years nursing. 20, she corrected. 20 years. The correction seemed to surprise him. His jaw tightened. Good. Let him be surprised. Let him see that she was still standing there, still breathing, still not impressed. 20 years pushing a cart and checking boxes has made you an expert in medicine. It hasn't. It's made you annoying. And annoying people have a way of finding themselves unemployed. He stepped back then, smoothing his coat like he'd been contaminated by the conversation. Keep your flags to yourself. Or keep your job. Your choice. He left before she could respond, which meant she didn't have to respond, which meant her face could remain exactly as it was, unmoved, undisturbed, a blank slate that revealed nothing of the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. She always was. That was what Baghdad had taught her, if nothing else. Always think 3 moves ahead. But that wasn't the worst part. At 11:23 a.m., Whitfield stood in the physician's lounge with a circle of residents clustered around the coffee machine, young doctors still soft enough to be impressed by titles and expensive suits. Danielle was passing through with a medication order, silent and present and completely invisible, which was why no one noticed her hearing every word. I'm going to make a wager, Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never lost a bet in his life. That woman, Ross, she won't last 7 days. 1 week from today, she'll quit. I'd stake real money on it. One of the residents laughed. What makes you so sure? Because she's the type. The careful type. The type who thinks she's better than everyone else but doesn't have the spine for confrontation. Watch, I'll make her job so uncomfortable that she'll walk. And when she does, we'll all be better off. He took a sip of coffee and smiled. It was the smile of a predator who'd already tasted blood. I give her 7 days. Maximum. Danielle placed the medication order on the counter and walked out without changing her pace, without tensing her shoulders, without giving him the satisfaction of knowing he'd been heard. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The challenge coin in her pocket felt heavier than it had that morning, like it was remembering something she'd tried to forget. 7 days, she thought. He's given himself 7 days to destroy me before he'll have to try harder. She was wrong about that. It would be much faster than 7 days. But as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the monitors beeped their endless electronic chorus, Danielle touched the coin through her scrub pocket one more time and made a choice. She would not quit. She would not fold. She would not give him the satisfaction of running, which meant she would have to survive him instead. She had survived Baghdad. She would survive St. Michael's. That was what she told herself, anyway. The cafeteria fell silent when Whitfield's hand connected with Danielle's tray. Mashed potatoes scattered across the tile like shrapnel. Gravy pooled around her shoe. 20 staff members stopped chewing and stared. You know what your problem is. Whitfield's voice carried the kind of casual cruelty reserved for people he'd already decided didn't matter. You think twice about everything. That hesitation? That's what separates the competent doctors from the nurse who just follows orders. Danielle stood motionless. The tray hung in her hands. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Maybe if you spent less time questioning your betters, you'd actually be competent." He turned to the residents flanking him like satellites. "In fact, I'm making this official. $20 says she quits within 7 days. Anyone want that action?" 3 residents laughed nervously. One actually dug into her pocket. Nobody looked at Danielle. That was the real cruelty. They were betting on her collapse as if she wasn't standing 3 feet away. She set the tray down on the nearest table. Bent. Began retrieving broken ceramic and soggy vegetables piece by piece. Her jaw clenched once. That was all. No flush of anger, no trembling hands, no voice that cracked when she finally spoke. "I'll need the patient chart for Bay 3, Dr. Whitfield." Flat. Professional. Exactly like she'd asked for the time. He threw it at her feet anyway. The folder exploded across the tile, paper scattering like a surrendered flag. The chart corner caught the edge of her shoe. For 10 full seconds, the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone and nobody moved. Danielle collected every page. Stacked them. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. When she looked up, her eyes held the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Anything else?" Whitfield's jaw tightened. He'd expected tears. A quavering voice. A retreat to the supply closet. Instead, she was already moving toward the chart rack, her back straight, her pace unhurried. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a junior attending named Chen, noticed something odd. The way her hands moved, how she retrieved the papers. Not like a nurse scurrying. Like someone trained. Like someone who'd done this 1,000 times under circumstances that would have shattered most people. But he dismissed it. Stress did things to nurses. Made them all weird eventually. "Bay 3 is waiting," Danielle said. Not a question. Not a plea. A statement of fact. The rounds that afternoon crystallized Whitfield's strategy. He began asking her questions in front of the residents, not the collaborative kind, but the gotcha kind. Loaded questions designed to expose gaps that didn't exist. "Ms. Ross, walk us through your fluid management protocol for the septic patient in Bay 7. She did. 2 minutes of precise clinical reasoning. Blood work correlation. Lactate trends. Albumin levels. The residents took notes. Interesting, Whitfield said, though his tone suggested nothing was interesting about it. Because that's not how we do things here. Maybe where you trained, wherever that was, they had different standards. Here, we prefer evidence-based medicine. He turned to the residents. Notice how she's wedded to outdated protocols? That's what happens when you don't stay current. You become a liability. Danielle was already moving to the next patient, already reading the monitor, already reviewing the labs. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't engage. This infuriated him more than any argument would have. The bet needed a timeline. He needed her to crack by Friday. That night, alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, Danielle finally allowed herself to breathe differently. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of absolute restraint. She pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her scrub pocket. The metal was worn nearly smooth from 20 years of her fingers turning it over in moments exactly like this. Baghdad. 2004, a 6-year-old boy bleeding out under enemy fire. Her hands moving without hesitation. The medal ceremony that never happened, the records that were burned, the official death certificate with her name that had been sealed in a vault somewhere. 3 breaths. In. Hold. Out. In. Hold. Out. In. Hold. Out. The coin caught the parking lot light as she turned it, the eagle on one side barely visible anymore. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, Navy SEAL Support, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars. Except officially, that woman had never existed. The operation was black. The extraction of the injured SEAL commander from that Fallujah street, classified. The child she'd pulled from the rubble, buried in an after-action report that had been shredded. She'd been told in an airless room at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, your service record is being retired. You will not acknowledge your military affiliation. You will assume a civilian identity effective immediately. You will never speak of what occurred in Baghdad. If you surface, if anyone connects you to that operation, the entire unit falls. Understood? She understood. She'd understood for 2 decades. Understood while she raised her daughter alone. Understood while she worked double shifts and skipped meals so her kid could have dance classes. Understood while she bit her tongue and bore the weight of invisible credentials that nobody could verify and she could never claim. The weight of that invisibility was different from the weight of combat. Combat was kinetic. You could fight back. This was suffocation wearing the mask of civility. Her phone buzzed. A text from her 8-year-old daughter, "Mommy, when you coming home?" She typed back, "Soon, baby. Love you." She sat in that car for 12 more minutes before she started the engine. The challenge coin went back into her pocket, pressed against her sternum like a heartbeat that nobody else could hear. By Thursday, Whitfield had begun making calls. She didn't know this yet, but she would. He'd contacted the hospital board member who'd hired her years ago, a retired admiral who owed Whitfield $200,000 in referral kickbacks, and suggested that maybe they'd made a hiring error. He'd pulled her references and found them thin. Called one directly, a former hospital in Charleston where she'd worked 3 years prior. Mentioned, very casually, that he was concerned about her decision-making patterns under stress. The reference coordinator, who'd never worked with Danielle, simply confirmed that yes, her file existed, yes, she'd been an employee. Whitfield spun that noncommittal response into ammunition. By Friday morning, he'd prepared the paperwork. Unauthorized procedures. Failure to follow protocol. Questioning medical authority. He had the board's ear. He had investors who needed her gone before she recognized the patterns in the billing codes, the $500 charges for procedures that cost $80, the phantom consultants who never actually consulted, the cascade of unnecessary tests that flowed from his network of allied physicians, each one taking their 30% cut from the top. But that wasn't how today would unfold. Today, at 2:51 a.m., everything changed. The monitor flatlined at 2:51 p.m. Commander James Reeves had walked into the exam room at St. Michael's that Tuesday looking every bit the decorated military officer he was, spine straight, movements economical, the kind of physical presence that didn't announce itself but rather occupied space like an immovable fact. Routine post-deployment checkup. Physical exam after 8 months rotating through Kandahar. Danielle had pulled his chart, noted his blood pressure at 118/74, his resting heart rate at 62. Everything textbook normal. Everything suggested another shift where she'd document vitals and fade back into the fluorescent-lit machinery of the emergency department. The resident physician, Dr. Kimura, had been conducting the examination when Reeves suddenly went rigid. No warning. No chest pain complaint. No gasping breath. Just a man whose body stopped cooperating mid-conversation, whose spine arched like something had seized control of every muscle simultaneously. The monitor screamed. A long, continuous wail that cut through the ambient hum of the exam room like a blade. Ventricular fibrillation. The heart was quivering instead of pumping. Oxygen wasn't moving. Brain death in for minutes if they didn't move now. Dr. Kimura froze. His hands hung at his sides like they'd forgotten their purpose. The nurse beside him, new resident named Patricia, looked at the monitor display as if it might spontaneously correct itself if she stared hard enough. The crash cart sat 5 feet away, untouched. Nobody moved toward it. Nobody called a code. Nobody did anything except stand there while a man's brain began to die. Danielle was already moving before her conscious mind caught up with her hands. 20 years ago, she'd stood in a field hospital in Baghdad's Jolan district with IED shrapnel in her hair and a 6-year-old boy bleeding out on a triage mat in front of her. She'd cracked his chest open with a scalpel and performed direct cardiac massage because the alternative was watching him die while waiting for surgical support that would never arrive in time. That muscle memory lived deeper than skin. It lived in the architecture of her nervous system, in the pathways her hands had traced 1,000 times in dark places. She moved to the exam table without hesitation. Step back. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a question. It was a command delivered in a voice that had dropped an octave, that belonged to someone who'd practiced authority under conditions that would have broken people who relied on titles instead of competence. Dr. Kimura blinked. Moved. His hands finally remembered what they were supposed to do, but he was already out of her way. Danielle's fingers found the space between Reeves' ribs. 4th and 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She knew this anatomy the way a violinist knows a string. Her hands moved on their own now, guided by 20 years of suppressed muscle memory that had waited in the dark for permission to emerge. One of the residents, Danielle didn't register which one, grabbed the crash cart. Good. Fast. Moving right. The room had gone quiet except for the monitor's continuous wail. The ventilator in Bay 3 down the hall wheezed its mechanical rhythm on. The fluorescent panels above hummed their steady electric song. Everything else held its breath. Her hands worked in precise rhythm. Direct cardiac massage through the chest wall. Pressure. Release. Pressure. Release. The motion was muscle memory and physics combined, her body weight behind each compression, her arms locked, her entire body functioning as a pump. 14-gauge needle, she said, and someone placed it in her non-dominant hand before she'd finished the sentence. The angiocath slid into the vein with a soft resistance that was almost familiar. She pushed epinephrine. 1 milligram for push. The syringe moved from her hand into Reeves' bloodstream like an extension of her will. Get a 4.0 endotracheal, she said. Not a request. Patricia moved without question, her eyes wide but her hand steady. The tube would secure his airway, keep his lungs inflated, give them a chance. Danielle kept compressions going. The rhythm was automatic now. Muscle memory. Pain was information. Pain in the wrists meant she was applying enough force. Pain meant the compressions were deep enough to move blood through the coronary arteries, to keep oxygen reaching the brain cells that were currently dying at an exponential rate. 30 compressions. 2 breaths from the bag valve mask. 30 more compressions. The protocol ran itself through her hands like a program written into her cellular memory. The monitor still flatlined. Ventricular fibrillation unchanged. His heart wasn't responding. Another round. Epinephrine again. 1.5 milligrams this time. The drug would increase peripheral vasoconstriction, would push what blood they were creating with chest compressions toward the brain and the heart. 2 minutes had passed. Maybe 3. Time compressed in crisis. Minutes became heartbeats. Heartbeats became the only thing that mattered. She didn't register Dr. Whitfield entering the room. Didn't notice him standing in the doorway, watching. Didn't see the way his face shifted as he observed her hands working, the way her movements followed a pattern that no civilian emergency nurse would possess. Military precision. Combat medicine. 20 years of technique that had never been trained away because it had been trained in at a level that civilian instruction couldn't touch. The defibrillator pads went on Reeves' chest. Someone, maybe Patricia, applied the gel. The machine charged with a sound like a small electrical storm building inside a plastic box. Clear, Danielle said. Everyone stepped back. The shock delivered with a thud that made Reeves' entire body convulse against the exam table. The monitor. Still flat. Still no rhythm. Another round of compressions. Her shoulders burned now, but the burning was distant information, something her brain registered and filed away as irrelevant. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 more. Adrenaline pushing oxygen to her muscles, keeping them firing at levels that would have been unsustainable if her body hadn't been built for exactly this kind of sustained, high-output emergency. For minutes. 5. The medical literature said brain death began around 4 minutes without perfusion. They were past that threshold. But Danielle had pulled people back from 5 minutes, from 6 minutes in Baghdad when the alternative was giving up and the enemy rounds were still coming down. Another shock from the defibrillator. Another charge. Another moment where Reeves' body arched against the table like someone had poured electricity through his spine. The monitor changed. First a single blip. Then another. The rhythm became jagged, irregular, but it was rhythm. It was a heart trying to beat. It was a man trying to come back from the edge of absolute darkness. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. Maybe Patricia. Maybe her own voice, she couldn't register which. Danielle kept compressions going, gentler now, maintaining perfusion while the medications worked their way through his system, while his heart remembered how to beat without external force applied to his ribs. 75. 80. 85 on the oxygen saturation monitor. Climbing. The numbers ticked upward like a prayer being answered. 90. 92. Stable. Danielle stepped back. Her hands trembled, but only now, only when the crisis had passed and her body realized the threat had been neutralized. The trembling was release. The trembling was restraint finally allowed to let go for a single moment before control reasserted itself. Ree's eyes opened. Unfocused. Confused. Alive. The room exhaled. The resident stared at her like she'd just reached into the chest cavity and pulled a working heart from thin air. But Danielle was already moving toward the sink to wash her hands, her mind already compartmentalizing the crisis into a file labeled complete, her body already transitioning back into the role she'd been playing for 20 years. That's when Dr. Whitfield stepped fully into the room, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on her hands, the steady hands, the precise hands, the hands that had just performed direct cardiac massage with the fluid technical knowledge of someone trained in conditions that required no hesitation and no mercy. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, pattering against the exam room window like applause. 2 hours later, the exam room was sterile again. Monitors hummed their mechanical prayer. The body on the stretcher, Commander James Reeves, was breathing on his own. Chest rising. Falling. Rising again. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Everything they'd trained for, executed without hesitation. Danielle stood at the sink, water running hot over her hands. The blood came off in pink spirals. She didn't watch it swirl down the drain. Her jaw was locked. Her shoulders were level. Her breathing was measured, for counts in, for counts out, the way you breathe when your hands have just cracked open a human ribcage and kept that human alive. She dried her hands on a paper towel. Methodical. Deliberate. No trembling. No satisfaction. Just the next task and the one after that. The door opened behind her. Dr. Whitfield entered with 2 hospital administrators flanking him like satellites around a dying star. His face was pale. Not shocked. Something worse. Recognition. His eyes tracked the blood still visible beneath her fingernails, the way she moved through the room like she owned the space, the muscle memory that had leaked into every gesture. Ms. Ross. His voice was different now. Clipped. Official. You're terminated. Effective immediately. For performing unauthorized medical procedures outside your scope of practice. Danielle turned to face him. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were flat. She didn't speak. Silence was heavier than denial. You're not a physician, one of the administrators said, younger, nervous. That procedure required a doctor's authorization. We have protocols. The protocols were being followed, Danielle said. Her voice was quiet. The patient was in cardiac arrest. No physician was present. By medical law, any trained personnel present can initiate emergency resuscitation until. Enough. Whitfield stepped forward. We don't need a lecture on statute from someone who was insubordinate before lunch. You violated the chain of command. You acted without authorization. You endangered hospital liability. Security is waiting outside. You'll collect your personal items and leave through the main entrance. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Danielle removed her badge. The lanyard came over her head like she was setting down a burden she'd been carrying for someone else. She placed it on the counter. The badge clattered against stainless steel. A small sound. An enormous one. She turned and walked past them toward the door. The younger administrator stepped aside. Whitfield didn't move. She had to angle her body sideways to pass him. His cologne was sharp, chemical, like synthetic confidence in a bottle. You should have quit when you had the chance, he said quietly, only for her to hear. She didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge. The door closed behind her. 30 seconds later, Whitfield was on the phone to 3 board members whose hospital contracts depended on his goodwill. Board members with mortgages and medical school tuitions and investment portfolios that couldn't afford his displeasure. He spoke in careful tones about concerns regarding staff competency, about unexplained gaps in her employment history, about inconsistencies in her credentials that we're investigating. What he didn't say was, she noticed. She knows. A hospital investigator arrived by 4 p.m. An external firm, paid consultants, people who owed nothing to anyone at St. Michael's except their retainer check. They interviewed Danielle's references, 3 former employers, all of them suddenly vague about dates and details. One of them received a call from Whitfield's attorney before her phone went back in her pocket. Another found his medical supply contract abruptly terminated. The third simply didn't answer follow-up calls. By 5 p.m., the investigator was writing preliminary findings about unverified nursing credentials, about gaps in documented clinical history, about possible fraudulent degree claims that warrant further scrutiny. None of it was true. All of it was devastating. Danielle watched it unfold from the parking garage as she sat in her Subaru. She didn't cry. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. She loaded the cardboard box from her locker into the back seat. 18 years of belongings. A coffee mug with a lighthouse on it. Photos of her daughter at kindergarten graduation. 3 copies of her diploma, each one legitimate, each one suddenly in question. At the bottom, wrapped in old hospital scrubs, the tarnished challenge coin. She held it for a moment. The weight was wrong. Too light now. Like holding proof of something that had been officially declared fiction. Security escorted her through the main lobby at 5:23 p.m. 4 of them. Professional. Polite. Devastating in their uniformity. Staff members who'd worked alongside her for 2 decades suddenly found their shoes interesting. A resident she'd trained how to stabilize a pneumothorax looked away. The chief nursing officer stood in her office doorway, mouth open, silent. Whispers followed her to the elevator. By the time the doors closed, she could hear them starting. The tarnished reputation. The questioned credentials. The narrative Whitfield had constructed with the precision of a surgeon, layers of insinuation, carefully placed calls, investigators who arrived with blank expressions and left with conclusions already written. The rain started as she drove. Not drizzle. Real rain. The kind that hammers the windshield and sounds like the sky has decided to end something. She didn't go home immediately. She couldn't. Not yet. Not while her hands were still steady and her face was still controlled. She drove to a parking garage near the riverfront in Savannah and sat in the bottom level where the ceiling was low and the concrete smelled like oil and rust. She turned the challenge coin over in her hands. Tarnished. Worn. The only physical evidence that Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had ever existed at all. Baghdad felt like a dream now. The operation in Jolan District. The 6-year-old boy pulled from rubble. The official burial of the entire mission, the classified aftermath, the order to disappear. 20 years she'd been nobody. 20 years she'd been safe because she was invisible. And invisibility had just been weaponized against her. Her phone sat on the steering wheel. Text messages from 3 other nurses asking if she was okay. An email from HR with separation paperwork. Nothing from the military. Nothing from the Pentagon. Nothing from anyone who would acknowledge that she'd ever been anything except a nurse they'd just fired. She almost threw the challenge coin out the window. Her arm was raised. The window was down. The rain was coming in sideways. It would have taken 2 seconds. 2 seconds and the last physical proof of who she was would be in a storm drain, heading out to the Atlantic. She pulled her arm back. Not yet. Not like this. Not in a parking garage with her armor still intact and no one watching to witness what she was losing. She drove home at 6:19 p.m. The house was quiet. Her daughter, Maya, 8 years old, had been picked up from after-school care by Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down, the neighbor who'd stepped into the space a mother working double shifts couldn't fill. Danielle found her at the kitchen table with a juice box and unfinished math homework, the orange liquid already brown at the edges. Maya looked up. Her mother standing in the kitchen doorway. The same mother who'd left for work that morning in scrubs with her badge. The mother who came home at night tired but present. The mother who made sure there was always someone who loved her, even if it had to be arranged and paid for and squeezed into gaps. Mommy. Maya's voice was small. Why are you home early? Why do you look so scared? Danielle stood in the doorway. Not moving. Not speaking. The rain was still hammering outside the kitchen window. The house was small and warm and completely insufficient against what had just happened. I'm not scared, baby. Her voice didn't crack. Training held. Composure held. But her hands, when she sat down at the table across from her daughter, finally stopped being steady. We just had a day. Some days are harder than others. Maya slid out of her chair and pressed against her mother's chest. Small arms. Smaller voice. I don't like hard days. Danielle held her. She held her and felt the weight of everything she'd sacrificed pressing down like an atmosphere. The medals locked away. The rank she could never claim. The operations that officially never happened. 20 years of being nobody so that this small person could have a mother. And now even that was being stripped away, not by the Navy, not by the Pentagon, but by a man in a hospital who saw her and recognized something dangerous and decided to burn it out. She was still sitting at the kitchen table at 8:13 p.m. when the sound came. Distant at first. A rhythm that didn't belong to the rain or the wind. A mechanical pulse that grew steadily louder, closer, overhead. Blades cutting through wet air. The sound of something heavy moving through the sky with absolute purpose. A helicopter. Then 2. Then 3. The windows rattled in their frames. Maya jumped up, frightened. Danielle stood slowly, moving toward the kitchen window. Through the rain, she could see searchlights cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the houses, the yards, the street where she'd walked to clear her head 1,000 times without being seen. The rotors thundered directly overhead. The whole house shook. And Danielle understood, in that moment, what was about to happen next. She reached down and squeezed Maya's shoulder once, her voice steady as the machines overhead. Go to your room, sweetheart. Lock the door. Don't come out until I come get you. Mommy, what's happening? Something that should have happened a long time ago. The helicopter searchlight swept across the driveway like celestial swords, and Danielle pulled her daughter close as boots hit the pavement, not police boots, not security. Military boots. The kind that moved with territorial certainty. Through the kitchen window, she watched them form a perimeter, weapons secure at their sides, and her daughter's fingers dug into her chest. Mommy, what's happening? The child whispered. Something that should have happened a long time ago, Danielle said, and she meant it. The next morning, the hospital lobby erupted. CNN played on every monitor simultaneously, a coordinated media ambush. The footage showed Danielle's photograph younger, desert camouflage, rank insignia visible on her shoulder. Her name crawled across the bottom of the screen. Decorated combat medic missing for 20 years, the chyron read. Standing beside a Pentagon official in full dress uniform was Commander James Reeves, his hand placed over his heart as he spoke directly into the camera. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross saved my life. Not once. Twice. When I was 6 years old in Baghdad, she pulled me from rubble under enemy fire. And last week, in this very hospital, she did it again. The footage cut to Dr. Whitfield's face mid-rotation. He went pale. The color drained like water from a basin. By noon, a 2-star admiral and 3 junior officers in navy dress blues walked through the main entrance of St. Michael's. They moved with the kind of deliberate calm that made people instinctively step aside. The admiral's presence altered the air pressure in every room, not threatening, but absolute. When they found Whitfield in his office, hunched over his desk reviewing insurance documents he'd already begun destroying, the admiral stood in the doorway and didn't speak immediately. He let the silence expand. Reeves entered behind him, and when their eyes met, the commander simply said one word. Nightingale. It was her call sign. Classified. Only 8 people in the world knew it. Whitfield's hands began to shake. The admiral stepped forward. His insignia caught the fluorescent light. Dr. Whitfield, you are in the presence of Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, United States Navy, attached to Naval Special Warfare Command. The words came measured and precise. Silver Star. The admiral paused. Reactions rippled through the hallway where staff had begun to gather. 2 bronze stars. Another pause. Longer. 2 purple hearts. The silence stretched 10 full seconds. Then, and you have conspired to fraudulently terminate a service member to cover insurance billing fraud totaling $847,000 over 18 months. The admiral held out a document with both hands, not a gesture of respect, but of official finality. A federal subpoena. CNN cameras were already rolling in the hospital corridor. Whitfield opened his mouth. No sound came out. The admiral's next words were spoken on speakerphone, deliberately loud enough for the entire 3rd floor to hear. St. Michael's Hospital's consulting contracts with this individual are terminated effective immediately. All billing irregularities identified will be forwarded to the Department of Justice with a recommendation for criminal prosecution. Whitfield tried to stand. His knees buckled. He gripped the desk for stability, and when he looked up, he made eye contact with at least 40 hospital employees standing in the hallway, nurses he'd bullied, residents he'd disparaged, orderlies he'd treated like furniture. Every single one of them was watching his face crumble. His mouth opened and closed. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. This is insane. You don't understand. The admiral raised his hand. You are finished, Doctor. 3 federal agents entered the room. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Whitfield's career was already ashes. 3 months later, Danielle drove past a strip mall on the outskirts of Savannah. The storefront read Discount Insurance Solutions. Through the window, she could see a folding table. Behind it sat Dr. Whitfield, or what remained of him. His name tag read, Steve. He was explaining term life premiums to a customer, his voice carrying the desperate pitch of a man selling his last option. He flinched when the door chimed. The man across from him didn't recognize him, but Danielle did. She saw the way his hands trembled on the paperwork. She saw the way his eyes darted toward the window when a police car passed. The New York State medical license was gone. The consulting contracts evaporated. The network of specialists who'd kicked back referrals had scattered like roaches when the lights came on. He was 43 years old and starting over as Steve the insurance guy, and every single shift, he wondered if federal agents were coming for him. They would be. The investigation was ongoing. A cream-colored envelope arrived at her apartment on a Thursday. Danielle knew what it was before she opened it. Inside, an invitation written in calligraphy: "The President of the United States requests your presence at a ceremony honoring service to the nation." The White House. East Room. Formal dress. Her daughter asked if she could come, and Danielle said yes. That Friday morning, she stood in front of her mirror and put on her dress uniform for the first time in 21 years. The fabric hung perfectly. She looked exactly like the person she'd been forced to bury. The East Room was packed with military officials, media, and her daughter in a navy dress holding flowers. Commander Reeves stood beside her in his service dress blues, his medal ribbons gleaming under the chandeliers. The president spoke about sacrifice, about service rendered in silence, about the cost of classified operations and the warriors who carried them alone. Then came the ceremony. Commander Reeves stepped forward with her medals. The Silver Star first, its silver cross catching the light. He pinned it to her chest. The room was absolutely silent. The 2 Bronze Stars came next. Third and fourth. When he reached for the final decoration, he held it longer than the others. The Navy Cross. The highest decoration for valor. He looked her in the eye as he pinned it, and for a moment, the 6-year-old boy she'd pulled from Baghdad rubble was visible in his face. "You brought me home," he said quietly. "You brought me home." Her daughter reached over and squeezed her hand. Danielle looked down at the medals catching light, each one a moment she'd been ordered to forget. That night, back at her apartment, she opened the shadow box she'd prepared weeks earlier. Inside, she placed the tarnished challenge coin, the one she'd carried through 20 years of forced invisibility, the one she'd held through humiliation and termination and her daughter's frightened voice at the kitchen table. The coin that had been her only proof. She didn't need it anymore. The medals did the talking now. The world knew her name. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Not just a nurse. Never just a nurse. She returned to St. Michael's 3 weeks later, but not as an employee. She walked through those doors wearing her dress uniform to sign the paperwork for the new trauma wing, the St. Michael's Navy SEAL Support and Trauma Care Center. The hospital board had voted unanimously to offer her the position of Chief of Trauma Services. She'd declined. Instead, she asked for the night shift in the emergency department. She wanted to work with her hands. She wanted to be the one who showed up when the world was breaking apart. On her first night back, she was standing at bay for checking vitals when a resident froze mid-examination. "Master Chief," the young doctor said, unable to make eye contact. "I watched the footage. I was here when." Danielle didn't look up from the monitor. "What's this patient's potassium level?" The resident checked the labs. 3.8. "Run another," Danielle said. "And get 2 units of packed cells ready. Something's not right." The resident moved. Around her, nurses and orderlies and residents worked with a different quality of attention now. When the trauma alert came in 20 minutes later, a motorcycle collision, 19-year-old male, BP dropping, the entire team moved in synchronized respect. She didn't bark orders. She didn't need to. They watched her hands. They watched the way she moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under artillery fire. When the patient stabilized, when his sinus rhythm held steady on the monitor, a young nurse whispered, "How did you know about the potassium?" Danielle was already moving to the next patient. "Pain is data," she said. "Everything tells you a story if you listen." Her daughter waited in the hospital lobby during her breaks, doing homework on a chair by the windows. Danielle would sit beside her for 10 minutes, and they wouldn't talk much. Her daughter would lean against her shoulder. That was enough. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Every single day she showed up, she was choosing not to be the person 20 years of invisibility had tried to make her. She was choosing to be the one who healed instead of the one who was broken. The evening news showed footage of Dr. Whitfield being escorted from his insurance office by federal agents, handcuffs clicking, his face buried in his hands, the shame radiating from him like heat. The reporter's voice was clinical. Former St. Michael's physician Dr. Marcus Whitfield is facing 15 counts of healthcare fraud and conspiracy, with investigations ongoing into his network of referring specialists. Danielle watched it once on the break room monitor. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply returned to work. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.